Latinos make up 20% of Boston's total population. 1 in 5 Bostonians is Latinx. Over the last decade, the number of Latinx folks has grown by 35%. This increase represents the largest population growth across all major ethno-racial groups. And we are young. Not me particularly, but the median age of Boston's Latinos is 29 years old, the youngest of the ethno-racial groups. In the Boston public schools, we are overrepresented. 42% of students are Latinx. In terms of Latino origin, the largest Latino population in Boston is Puerto Ricans, who, let's not forget, are US citizens by birth. Puerto Ricans have a slightly larger population count than Dominicans. Both have over 36,000 residents. Salvadorans, Colombians, and Mexicans are the next largest Latino populations, with between approximately 7,900 and 14,000 residents. Smaller Latino populations in Boston are Guatemalans, Hondurans, Cubans, and Peruvians. I could go on and on listing all sort of data points, but I would be remiss if I did not mention that the source of these particular data points is a recent publication from the Gaston Institute at UMass Boston. This report is part of a collection titled Latinos in Massachusetts. It's a rich series of reports that illustrate the footprint of Latinos across the Commonwealth, and it focuses on the 11 cities with large Latinx populations. Now, I'd like to present our moderator for the event, Ivan Espinosa Madrigal, who is the executive editor of Lawyers for Civil Rights. Take it away, Ivan.
Muy buenas tardes. Good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure to be here. My name is Ivan Espinosa Madrigal, and I am the Executive Director of Lawyers for Civil Rights. I am here in my capacity as co-chair of the Greater Boston Latino Network, an organization of a collection of 9 different Latino organizations across Greater Boston come together to work collaboratively on Latino issues. It is a pleasure to be here tonight. Thank you, Marcela, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you, Rosario Vieira Minaya of Amplify Latinx, for also convening us and launching into this event. I want to thank Amplify Latinx, the Greater Boston Latino Network, the Boston Globe, the Massachusetts LGBT Chamber of Commerce, and the Boston Debate League for sponsoring this event. And I want to welcome Councillor Sabi George and Councillor Michelle Wu to this event. It is really wonderful to be here today with all of you. A couple of housekeeping things before we get started. The forum will be recorded. It is being recorded via Zoom and will be shared via YouTube after the event. So this will be made available to the public. This forum is available in Spanish and English. To hear the live translation, please select the globe icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen and select Spanish. Si usted desea escuchar esta presentación, este evento hoy en español, por favor vaya al icono del globo que aparece hacia abajo en la pantalla de Zoom y seleccione, por favor, la selección de español para poder escuchar esta presentación en español esta noche. It is just that simple to be able to get the Spanish translation going. If you have any issues, please direct a message to the host of the event so that they can assist you. This forum is free and open to the public and the media. Already in the distinguished audience that is here, almost 100 people, we have a number of reporters. So thank you very much for joining us this evening. As MC and moderator, I will be strictly enforcing time limits, and we assume it's easy. I could just mute you. So let's be all very attentive to the time limits so that we can have a really spirited debate within the confines of the time allotted. Each candidate will have 4 to 5 minutes to make opening remarks so that they can introduce themselves. And we have selected a number of questions that will be asked by myself as moderator, but also by a host of partners that are joining us this evening. We will be hearing from Grace Moreno, who runs the Massachusetts LGBT Chamber of Commerce, by Doctora Vanessa Calderon Rosado, the CEO of Inquilinos Boricuas en Acción, IBA. We will also be hearing from our youth, Eliana Rivas of Fenway High School and Catherine de Jesus Martinez of Boston International High School. I will be indicating when the allotted time is reached and when candidates should be wrapping up or stopping. For each of the questions, just so we are clear, after the introduction, for the intros, you have 4 to 5 minutes, but for each of the subsequent questions, it is a 4-minute time limit. Follow-up questions will be permitted if time allows. We will be rotating the order that the questions are presented so that we rotate it among the candidates. Audience members will be attending this forum virtually, of course, and will have an opportunity to submit questions privately to me, to the host. And questions can be submitted confidentially without identifying information if you want to do it anonymously. And some of the questions may be selected if time allows so that we can incorporate them into the forum. Please do not ask any type of intimate questions, personal in nature. We will not select those questions. Keep them relevant to the forum. Props are not allowed. Campaign literature, buttons, signs, clothing, and any other campaign-related items must not be overtly presented on the Zoom screen so that we are not distracting from the discussion in general. Lastly, if you have any technical issues, please contact the host for assistance. And I want to again welcome very warmly Councillor Michelle Wu and Councillor Anissa Sabi George, our 2 candidates running for Mayor of Boston. Thank you for joining us this evening. And I'm going to kick us off by proceeding to introductory remarks. We are going to start with you, Councillor Wu, followed by Councillor Sabi George. Councillor Wu, you have 4 to 5 minutes to make introductory remarks.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for having both of us and for convening across so many organizations that have been leading the charge on issues of equity and inclusion and justice. I don't know, I could maybe see in Councillor Sabi George's mind the thoughts that I was having. We are so used to 45-second or 1-minute timeframes, and then a quick new 4 minutes sounds so luxurious. So I will try to still be concise within that. We are in a moment of great transformation, great opportunity, and great choice in our city. I'm someone who comes from an immigrant family. My parents came to the United States not speaking English, nothing in their pockets. And as the oldest kid, I've known my whole life what it feels like to be the one that's pushed out in front as a young child as the official translator and interpreter for the family. I never imagined that I could be or would want to be anywhere near government or especially politics, because in my family, the suspicion and the skepticism of a political system had pushed immigration over multiple generations in our family tree. And so this for me has been a journey of living the stakes of policy, coming up in frustration against the systemic challenges and gaps that so many of our families fall through. In my early 20s, my mother, as she was becoming a single mom, began to struggle with mental health challenges. And as she was diagnosed with late onset schizophrenia, I stepped in as her caregiver and to raise my 2 sisters in Boston. This city has given my family everything we cherish, and I fight to make sure that what I know is possible, the chance to access great schools and raise my sisters and now my 2 kids, to access incredible healthcare and see my mom stabilized, to be part of community building that is stronger and more active than most places across the country, that is all possible if you can get through the hoops, if you can get across the wide disparities, if you can get over the many barriers that stand in the way. I've had now a decade of experience in City Hall working for Mayor Menino, and now 8 years on the Boston City Council, seeing what a difference it makes when we use the levers of power of city government to make a difference in closing those gaps and delivering changes. I'm proud of our track record of building coalitions to take on what people always said would be impossible fights, one after another, because we were centering the urgency of our communities, the urgency in Black and Brown families, immigrant families, in the systemic challenges that we have the power through legislation and action in city government to address. We passed a language access ordinance that reshaped the guarantee for access to city services. We pushed so that Boston became one of the first cities in the country to pass paid parental leave. We've taken on climate justice initiatives that have gone to the root of environmental injustices that communities of color, and particularly immigrant and Black and Brown families, bear. For me, this is a moment where we all need to step up. And to meet this moment, our actions in the city of Boston must center community voice, racial justice, and planning for that brightest future that includes each one of us. And so I'm determined to ensure that we lead the way once again in a city that has a tremendous legacy of reshaping the national conversation and beyond, to deliver affordable housing, to invest in quality supported schools for each one of our kids, to ensure that we are closing the racial wealth gap and preparing for the challenges of the future. I know Boston has everything we need. I'm eager to make sure that we are building the community political will from the mayor's office that will connect every single resident to being part of these conversations. So thank you so much for having us, and I'm really excited for the conversation to follow.
Thank you, Councillor Wu, and thank you for sticking to the time limit. I am now turning to Councillor Sabi. George, you have the stage.
Thank you very much, Yvonne, and everyone for welcoming us this evening. I've set my timer and will do my best to keep track of it. I believe today that I am the right leader for this city, for this moment. As a Boston Public Schools teacher for 13 years, I had a front row seat to the challenges our families face and our students face day in and day out. Those years at East Boston High School have prepared me for this work in a very special way. I'm also a small business owner. I know how devastating this pandemic has been on our businesses and what it will take to recover and thrive post-pandemic. This work has prepared me for the work of leading the city in a very special way. I'm also the very proud mother of 4 teenage boys and want to wish my Douglas, who turned 17 today, a very happy birthday. We'll have cake when this forum is over. I know as a parent what it's like just trying to make it all work for our family. I will bring my experiences, those and many more, to City Hall, but most importantly, I will lift up the voices and experiences of all Boston residents to drive the work that we must do to build a better city for all. And we have a lot of work to do to get there. I am very proud to be a first-generation American, the daughter of 2 immigrants with 2 very different immigration stories. My mother is Polish and immigrated to this country after World War II. My grandmother at the age of 14 was taken from her home in Poland to work in a labor camp in Germany. My grandfather was a prisoner of war in the Polish army. They met in a displaced persons camp where my mother was born. They immigrated to the United States when my mother was little. My father is an Arab, a Muslim from Tunisia, immigrated to the United States in his early 20s, met my mother, and together they built a family built on some very shared values around family. Although they came from very different places, different cultures, different religions, they shared some very certain things in common, and that certainly was a love and appreciation for them, for each other and for their family and for education. Immigrants in this city, including my family, have built Boston, and they continue to play a very critical role in the future of our city. In everything the city of Boston does, we have a responsibility to be intentional about building an inclusive and equitable city. We have to tear down barriers, language barriers, barriers to a great education, barriers to jobs and housing and transportation and healthy food. City Hall must be a reflection of Boston itself, its racial and ethnic diversity, its wealth of experience and culture. To get to that, to understand that, you have to show up in all of our neighborhoods. That's what I've done as an at-large city councilor and what I will continue to do as mayor. And as your mayor, I will be present and accessible on the ground in your neighborhoods to hear firsthand about your stories, your struggles and our successes. I will uplift your voices and let your experiences inform the work and drive the agenda. And I will bring us together to have the tough but necessary conversations to better understand each other and collaborate to find real solutions to the challenges we face as a city together. And we have a lot of work to do to get there. It will take each and every one of us to create that stronger, more just, more inclusive Boston. And I ask you to join in this hard work with me to do it together. Thank you, everyone, and I look forward to this evening's discussion.
Thank you very much, Councillor, and also thank you for sticking to the time limits. This is a terrific start to this event, and I just want to take a moment to acknowledge among the more than 120 participants and audience members, some of our dignitaries. We have His Excellency Alberto Fierro Garza, who is the Consul General of Mexico to New England. We have the chairwoman of the Boston Redevelopment Authority, the BPDA, Priscilla Rojas. We have the director of the Gaston Institute, Professor Lorna Rivera, and we have James Canales, the president of the Bar Foundation, among many other dignitaries. With no further ado, I'm going to turn the stage over to our first partner, the Boston Debate League. On behalf of the Boston Debate League, we have two amazing Boston metro area youth who will be asking the first questions to our candidates. I want to welcome to the stage Eliana Rivas from Fenway High School and Catherine de Jesus Martinez of the Boston International High School. I'm going to start with you, Ms. Rivas, so that you can ask your question to the candidates. As a reminder to the candidates, we are alternating. So this question, we had an opportunity to start with Councillor Wu. So I'm going to actually start this one with Councillor Sabi George. We have 4 minutes again, so it's a little bit shorter than the intro remarks. And then I'm turning it over to you, Eliana, so you can kick it off.
Great. Sorry, I cannot unmute myself, but my question is, in what ways is your public safety plan unique and effective in dismantling racism and discrimination in the police?
Working on that unmute and setting my timer. Ileana, thank you so much for your question, for your engagement, and for your participation in this evening's discussion. As a graduate of the Boston Public Schools and as someone who was engaged in BPS through my school and through BSAC, as well as the State Student Advisory Council, your engagement really speaks volumes to the bright future that you have and that your classmates have. So I'm just grateful for your presence this evening. There is so much work that we have to do to improve the trust between our immigrant communities in particular and our police. And there's so much work that we have to do to dismantle racism, both in our policing system, as well as all of our other systems for housing, for education, for transit, for climate justice, and all of the work in between. I know that many of our immigrant communities are less likely to report crime due to the fear that the police will look at their immigration status or that of a family member or friend. Boston requires a multifaceted, coordinated response to and an investment in community policing across our city, that we are building relationships with neighborhood leaders and organizations and making sure that we have appropriate police staffing and enforcement and community programming, as well as initiatives across our city. We need to build and create a more diverse, Boston Police Department that promotes and retains police officers as color. If we are truly going to be responsive to the needs of our community members, we need to make sure that our Boston Police Department and its leadership reflects the communities in which are served, and that our specialized units also reflect the communities that we serve across our city. And when I think about the diversity that is so wonderful to be celebrated here in the city of Boston, the fact that it's still today that our policing system in particular has high rates of complaints of discrimination and high rates of racism still built into the work. We've got to work every day to dismantle that, to take that down, to change our system of policing in particular, so that it is more transparent, that we are holding police officers responsible to the commitment to community, and that we are working in partnership around that accountability. For sure, we have to institute more mandatory. We have to institute mandatory, not more mandatory. We need to make sure that our training is mandatory across the board, and that both new and existing police officers have strong programming that's embedded in the work around racial bias, de-escalation training, and best practices for responding to mental health crises across our city in all of our communities. I've led the work on the Boston City Council to make sure that when Boston Police is responding to calls for help, that we are working every day to make sure that we are providing appropriate responses. On the council, I've led on making sure that we have best clinicians, licensed clinical providers doing the response in partnership with police around mental health calls, and that we are being much more proactive in responding to the high utilizers of our 911 system, both on the police side as well as on the EMS side. When our city's residents are calling for help, when they are in a crisis, the services they often need are not police services, but the crisis gets to such a point that that is what is necessary. We've got to work to be more proactive and connect our city's residents to both primary care, mental health care, housing services, family support services, especially as it relates to concerns around domestic violence. And that when we are providing those services, we are doing it in a culturally competent way, and that we are also doing it considering the languages that are necessary and with particular sensitivities to the communities in which we serve across the board.
Thank you, Councillor. I want to now turn the stage to Councillor Wu so that she may respond to the question posed by Eliana Rivas.
Thank you so much, Eliana, for your question. Before I get to answering the heart of it, which was the specifics and the plans that stand out and what is unique, I just want to spend a little bit of time on my track record of already pushing to dismantle structural racism within policing and public safety in Boston. I've served on the council for 8 years. I'm proud to have shepherded through many pieces of legislation in coalition with community. And Boston became one of the first cities across the country and one of the first or the largest on the East Coast when we passed our ordinance banning racially discriminatory face surveillance technology from the Boston Police and other city agencies. There are concrete documented ways in which the actions of our police department have been shown to be perpetuating structural racism since long before the murder of George Floyd and so many others, long before a national reckoning on systemic racism. And the very same recommendations from the Police Reform Task Force have echoed the results of a 2015 audit of the police department, which have echoed the calls from community members for decades about the need for deep reforms to not just the structure, but the culture of this department. And we have seen steps move forward, such as the creation of the OPAT office, Office of Police Accountability and Transparency, and such as continued legislation that we will hopefully be voting on the council very soon, a companion ordinance to our face surveillance ban that would require community oversight of surveillance technology, as well as stopping and prohibiting coordination between Boston school safety officers and federal immigration authorities, stopping the school to deportation pipeline. We need to pass this, and we have been pushing for this for more than a year now. And so when it comes to where we are moving forward, I know personally the impact of standing with my mom as she's been in episodes of psychosis when the police were called, and feeling the terror of just hoping that that interaction wouldn't go the wrong way because an armed law enforcement officer was responding to a situation where we needed public health and mental health support instead, and begging for her to be sent to the hospital instead of the police station. I've led the charge on the council to ensure that we are creating that response, not just to continue to have officers be there on scene alongside professionals, but to have a separate force where we would be responding to residents in greatest need, such as other cities are doing, where they have not only seen better outcomes for community members, but saving money because we're actually providing the service the first time around. And we are moving forward. Mayor Janey has already launched a pilot on this following from our conversations on the city council. My plan for reforming our police is on our website, so I hope you will check that out too, michelleforboston.com. There are some major pieces to it. One is to really expand and institute a public health approach to crisis response. Two is to get overtime under control. We need accountability for budget dollars and to be directing our funding to tackling the root causes of trauma and violence in our communities, not over-policing. We need accountability for misconduct and to fully fund the OPAT office and to ensure that we are not shielding officers from misconduct. And we need to ensure that we are also leading with transparency. Far too many of the data points that have now become part of the conversation had to be subpoenaed or obtained through organizations such as ones represented in this conversation today. And we need to have that full trust through transparency with our department. I'm committed to making sure that we get at the documents that actually are the barriers to implementing these conversations we have year after year. I'm the only candidate in the race who has put forward a specific plan for how to negotiate the police union contract, which is where we need to embed accountability and transparency. We would demand that we take certain items off the table when it comes to discipline in the most serious cases. We would ensure accountability and structural changes in the roles and the responses. And we would ensure that our funding is going to be allocated in a way that matches our community's needs. So
thank you, Councillor.
Thank you very much.
So I do want to now turn it over to our second really fabulous student, Catherine de Jesus, because she has another question to ask the two of you. Can we please spotlight Catherine de Jesus Martinez? Catherine, the floor is yours. And for this question, we'll start with Councillor Wu. And as a reminder, let's keep answers to 4 minutes.
Great. Good evening, councillors. My question is, as you both probably know, there is a current problem in drug addiction around the Mass Ave area, and where many times addicts will go on the train and inject themselves there, making the passengers feel very unsafe, and it's not very welcoming and it's not safe at all. So I want to know, how as the mayor will you help them, and you will help to ensure citizen safety?
Councillor Wu, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Catherine. And I'm going to set my timer so I know where the time is. Thank you so much for this question. We know that the intersection near Mass Ave and Melnia Cass Boulevard is the epicenter for a citywide and regional set of crises, a humanitarian crisis that is the overlap of substance use, of mental illness, and also homelessness. And so I've put forward a plan that would attack the root causes of this because we need to just be honest that right now the city's approach hasn't been working. We have been putting lots of resources into this area, but when we continue to just clean the streets now multiple times a day, or rush city workers to pick up needles as quick as possible, even though there's so much work and so many dollars being spent to try to mitigate the symptoms, until we tackle the root causes here, we will be right back at square one the next morning. And so we need a public health and housing approach here. I am committed in my first 100 days to ensure that we are connecting and expanding access to medication-assisted treatment and care that patients need, in partnership with and building on conversations that I've already started having with providers in the area at Boston Healthcare for the Homeless and Boston Medical Center and community health centers all across our city. We need to also ensure that fundamentally we're expanding supportive housing across the city. There are buildings that are publicly owned that are underutilized, which should be retrofitted very, very quickly so that we can ensure people are not on the streets, especially as the weather gets cold. And so that is an immediate, urgent priority. We need to be in a regional conversation with cities around the area. And I think we've already seen in the news recently that, again, there are opportunities to partner and housing and programming that's available that we could expand and invest in. But having that conversation and ensuring that we are all on the same page across different levels of government and across different cities will be the way to ensure that we're actually moving this forward. There's a tremendous amount of resources available because we have already been putting that into the situation. So for me, it is a combination of outreach and investing in public health street teams to connect and make sure we are wrapping around the residents and patients who are in this area, expanding access to healthcare and services and treatment, and then getting at the housing foundation with supportive housing being quickly made available.
Thank you very much, Councillor Wu. I have to say, I love the questions that are being asked by the students. They're just so timely and relevant for what's happening in the city. Councillor Sabi George, you're next.
Yeah, thank you very much, Catherine, for this question, and certainly the challenges that we're seeing that are being experienced by individuals who are not well, and the impact that that has on the surrounding communities, on those coming and going from work and building business in that community certainly is and can be devastating to everyone. I also want to note that what's happening at Mass and Cass is happening across our city in each one of our neighborhoods. We see it for sure in Downtown Crossing, we see it in Andrew Square, we see it in Nubian Square, Mattapan Square, in the Back Bay, throughout our city, in so many communities. The suffering is real and we see it. I also want to note, as we talk about the challenges of mental health, the challenges of substance use disorder, and the difficulties that come with it, we also see, unfortunately don't see, how much of that is happening across households in our city. When I joined the council in 2016, I was the chair of a committee that I helped find in partnership with Councillor Wu on homelessness, mental health, and recovery. And through that work, I convened both roundtables with shelter providers on the individual side, as well as on the family side, as well as with mental health providers who are doing so much work, but still even today, doing a lot of that work in silos. As mayor of the city, I will direct the city's Health and Human Services Cabinet Secretary to convene and rejuvenate the Mass and Cass Task Force. It is work that I participated in. It's also in addition to work I did in the South End around some of the boots on the ground efforts. We need to make sure that we today and in the next few weeks review the status of the Mass and Cass Task Force plan, make sure that we have an ability to continue implementing certain aspects of that work that many community members and leaders came together to build, and make sure that we are looking at new approaches that reflect the changes in healthcare due to the COVID-19 pandemic. I will work to make sure that we are preserving the nearly 500 shelter beds that are across our city, and making sure that we are also increasing recovery service capacity, that we are decentralizing services away from the Mass and Cass area and working in partnership with other cities and towns and state agencies and those in the state delegation, not just the Boston delegation, but beyond that, to make sure that other cities and towns are helping us in this effort. Today, we know about almost 70% of the individuals coming to our city for services who are dealing and struggling with homelessness, who are struggling with substance use disorder, as well as stimulant disorder. As we see the drugs on the street change, we know that we need help from other communities because so many individuals are coming from other places. We need help. I've seen firsthand the challenges of violence against women, human trafficking and the sexual trade, as well as the increase in aggravated assault and homicide as it relates to the population in our city that is struggling and facing the crisis and chaos of homelessness. I will create a city-level consumer advisory board made up of individuals who are in long-term recovery and look at harm reduction services, what it means to make sure that we are constantly working towards and reassessing and revising plans and services so that those that are most impacted and those with lived experiences are involved in the work. I will also create, as mayor, an interagency mental health commission, something I'm working on today as a city councillor, so that we are pulling together city officials, community members, those immersed in this work to look at policy recommendations to improve access to mental health services across our city, and that we are utilizing federal funding, the ARPA funds, to immediately and sustainably impact the lives of so many individuals at Mass and Cass. And last, it's listed on my website, a public health surge to make sure that we are meeting people where they are and getting them into the services and the supports, getting them the supports they need to find long-term wellness. I'm also a proponent of rebuilding the Long Island Bridge and investing in facilities and longer-term care programs on that island that include detox, recovery, workforce development, efforts around mental health, and family reunification efforts.
Thank you, Councillor. Thank you, Councillor. And I could see from the hot chat that people are definitely tuning into these questions with over 130 people in the audience. That's terrific. One of the things that I wanted to do is remind people that the chat feature can be used not just for comments, as people have been doing, but also to share potential questions for the Q&A component. If we have time remaining, we will go through the chat to identify a few questions. So please feel free to do that using the chat feature so that you can actively participate and propose questions for the candidates. The next component, which follows the incredible questions that were posed by Eliana Rivas of Fenway High School and Catherine De Jesus of Boston International High School on behalf of the Boston Debate League. Thank you guys for that amazing set of questions. The next component is dedicated to the Greater Boston Latino Network. I want to use this opportunity to give a shout out, and not just to Dr. Vanessa Calderon Rosado, who is in the audience, Executive Director of Inquilinos Boricuas en Acción, a leader of the steering committee of the Greater Boston Latino Network, but also to Karen Chacon, who is the head of Latino STEM, co-chair of the network, and Alex Oliver Davila, Executive Director of Sociedad Latina, also a co-chair of the network. It is a pleasure for us to partner with Amplify Latinx in this event. Welcome, Betty Francisco. It's wonderful to see you in the audience. So my question to you guys on behalf of the Greater Boston Latino Network is an issue surrounding Latino representation. We have had tremendous growth in the Latino community in the city. Much of that is really outlined and confirmed by the census data that shows significant growth in our community across the city in many different neighborhoods. And yet Latino representation lags behind. It lags behind in City Hall, in city government offices, in departments, boards, and commissions. And so my question really is, how will you ensure that there is proportional representation across all city agencies and offices to represent the Latino community? And can we have a commitment from you that you will work to achieve 20% Latino representation across city offices? I think this is really important for the audience that you have here tonight as candidates, and a conversation that shouldn't be new, because I think these conversations have emerged organically over the last few months as the campaigns have rolled out and as different census data and other points are coming into account. And so I really want to turn to this question. And we started the last question with Councillor Wu. So I want to start this one with you, Councillor Sabi George, about 20% Latino representation across city offices to ensure more meaningful and robust Latino voice and engagement in your administration, should we have you as mayor.
No, it's certainly a great conversation, something that we have to commit to. And in previous conversations with smaller groups, I've committed to having that 20% Latino representation across all city departments, especially in those leadership positions. It's so important that we are committed to that work and doing that work for real. And, you know, we talk a lot about representation matters, and we have to take a look at our city departments, and I'm committed to doing an early transition audit of leadership across our city. And that is not just about those doing the work every single day. It's also about those that have been appointed to our boards and commissions across all fields and sort of all city departments. I think it's also important when we say things like representation matters, and when I commit to, as mayor, building a diverse cabinet, one that is representative of the city and our city's diversity, that it truly does reflect our city's diversity, but that it's more than just a photo op, that cabinet members, that chiefs and commissioners and department leaders have been empowered and have the authority to share in decision-making alongside me as mayor. When I'm elected mayor of this city, I look forward to leading a city of almost 700,000 individuals, a city that doubles in size every single day, that has really important work to do around housing and education and economic development and public safety and public health. But that those that I charge with and partner with in leadership have the authority that they need to do their work. It has to be, again, as I mentioned, more than simply a photo op. This work has to be meaningful, and those around me need to be empowered to do that work. And representation matters in such an important way that there is a true reflection in city leadership with, oh, there goes my, oh, maybe not. It's city leadership here in the city of Boston, and that we are taking a very hard look at it. I appreciate the question. I think it's one that has come up in many forums and many discussions, and one that I am committed to as mayor of this city. And I would say, you know, it's important to also reflect back. I see I've got a few more minutes, so I'm going to use it, a few more seconds. And I reflect back in my current capacity as a city councillor and the team that I have built at City Hall in that office. It too is a reflection of our city. My chief of staff is a Latina, and I've always had Latino representation in my office. It's really important that in that work, there's a reflection of the city.
Thank you very much, Councillor. That was a really great response, and I think reassuring for many people in the audience. Councillor Wu, I want to turn to you for the same question about a commitment to 20% Latino representation, voice, accountability, meaningful integration. Would love to hear from you, your position on this issue, Councillor.
Yes, thank you so much. And I am eager and excited to reiterate my earlier commitment to reaching those proportions, and to emphasize that in the teams that I have built across City Hall and campaigns, we have already been well above those thresholds over the years that I've been in office. And it's not because this is a box to check, but truly, if we want to deliver impact with our policies, with our funding, with the powers that we have in city government, we need to have these decisions being made by people who are connected to our communities and directly continuing to open the doors. And so how do we have accountability on these commitments? Of course, we need to know what the numbers are, and we should do more than just a one-time check of it. There should be an ongoing transparency and dashboard and availability for anyone to be able to look at this across all different levels of government, cabinet, city staff, boards and commissions, and all the places that the city of Boston has influence. And I've been leading the charge as well. I know this is a little bit tangential, but related to this in terms of where our spending is going on the contracting side and ensuring there's wealth building and representation of our entrepreneurial community in the spending dollars that go out through city contracts in addition. How do we get there and what are the mechanics? We need to ensure that the business of the city is accessible to everyone from the very start of the conversations, that language access isn't just an afterthought at the end of a process of developing a form and then trying to get it translated after the original application has already gone out, which we already saw happen during the pandemic and resulted in gaps in terms of how our rental assistance went out initially and required and through feedback from community members and advocates, corrections to that process. I was proud to author and champion in coalition with community members the city's language access ordinance, which we passed a number of years ago to guarantee that. We need to ensure also that we are accounting for what has happened in the past. So I also do want to take this space publicly to say that what happened in the Boston School Committee in terms of the impact on the Latinx community and the lack of follow-up there to address how that situation occurred and to address accountability on the city side for information that went out publicly, I continue to vow to take that on and ensure that we are going back and ensuring that that does not happen again. So I wanted to emphasize that my public response initially did not reflect the full responsibility and opportunity that we have to continually confront racism and the ways in which our power structures are not reflective and discourage participation or exclude our communities. We need to be continuing to build a pipeline so that there's not a scramble to ensure that there's representation on this or that part of a board or commission, but that there are ongoing conversations and structures in partnership with community organizations so that the business of city government is fully integrated with organizations in the community and that there is a direct connection so that there's a natural flow and continuing growth of our pipeline into leadership.
I want to thank you, Councillor, for that very meaningful response as well, and particularly for facing head-on the issue with the Boston School Committee, which is, of course, of great consequence to the Latino community and the people gathered here tonight. And my second question is actually related to that. We have had 2 appointments that have been made by Mayor Kim Janey to the Boston Public School Committee. The appointments are Rafaela Polanco Garcia, the first Spanish-speaking, monolingual Spanish-speaking person appointed to the committee, and also Lorena Lupera, a leader in Latinos for Education and very active in the community. Both of these school committee appointments represent a tremendous value to the Latino community. And there's been much conversation about whether these people will be able to keep their seats if there is a mayoral transition, which obviously there will be. And so I'm wondering about your position on the retention of Lorena Lupera and Rafaela Polanco Garcia on the school committee. Councillor Wu, the next question was for you. So this might seem like a little bit of a follow-up, but obviously we will also want to hear from Councillor Sabi George on the issue of the composition of the school committee for the Latino community.
Yes, as was mentioned in the introduction by Marcela Garcia, that the quality, the resources, the opportunities within our Boston public schools, of course, impact every single family in Boston. But we know by the numbers that the Latino community is a huge proportion of the stakeholder group that represents our school communities and makes up the future of decision-making in the Boston public schools. And so I will certainly ensure that there is as long as there are still appointed seats on the Boston School Committee, which is a separate conversation in terms of changing the structure, that if I have the ability to appoint, and in the short term as mayor, whoever is the next mayor will, that I will ensure there's representation of the Latino community. And we are in the process right now of starting, because it's necessary, with the November 16th change and transition and swearing in of a new administration. We are in the process of already starting to assemble what a transition could look like, so that there are community conversations around leadership across all levels, again, cabinet, how we think about city staff, the first 100 days, as well as major appointments and boards and commissions. And so that will be an ongoing conversation, but representation and engagement of the community will drive that.
And I want to turn, of course, to Councillor Sabi George on a response for the same question about Lorena Lopera and Rafaela Polanco Garcia, Latino representation in the school committee.
No, it's a really important question, and one that a number of us have discussed over the last few months. I am committed to a diverse school committee body that represents our school community, our students, our families, and our city. And I have committed to making sure and ensuring that we have Latino representation on the Boston School Committee. I've also, just as an aside, as a member of the City Council and as chair of the Council's Committee on Education, I've led the work to ensure that the student member of the Boston School Committee has the opportunity and the full powers of voting, as well as receives the stipend. You know, we've worked on that ordinance, that home rule petition, over the last couple of months, and hope to have that wrapped up before the end of this calendar year. I've also supported the legislation to create, I think, a really productive and constructive conversation around the future of the governance structure of the school committee. And before all of you on the November 2nd ballot, you will have an opportunity to voice your position, your opinion on whether or not the Boston School Committee should be an elected body or an appointed body. I think it's also important to note through this period of transition, we have started through my campaign and a small transition team looking at all of the appointments that have been made during this interim period and the opportunity to retain appointments or the possible necessity to go back and review all of those appointments from the school committee to other boards and commissions over this interim period, because all of those are interim appointments, and whether or not we have to go back to the nominating process. And the nominating process for me as a city councilor, as a former educator, someone who's engaged in this work very directly, that nominating process is a place where we need to create greater transparency. We need to create greater engagement by our communities, by our families, and by our young people in that process. And I'm committed to doing that initially in those early days, because I believe that that nominating process will have to be engaged pretty quickly. And so as we go through, not just making sure that there's appropriate representation, but that we are not short-handed in those early days of a new administration through that early period of transition. But I am committed to making sure that we have a school committee that is reflective of our city and of our student body, and that we have Latino representation on that. And I think that the 20% conversation that we're aiming towards and setting as a goal should be the floor, should be the start, should be the bottom, and that those voices also have opportunities for shared power and authority in that work.
Well, thank you both for those meaningful responses. I am hearing both of you taking a position that Latino representation at 20% is is very important. And so that is a very meaningful commitment for the Latino community today. But I'm also hearing some reluctance to committing to keeping Lorena Lopera or Rafaela Polanco Garcia from both of you. So I just want to name that. But in the interest of moving the agenda forward, I'm going to continue the program. So we are partnering tonight with the Massachusetts LGBT Chamber of Commerce, one of our main partners in this event tonight. And so I want to welcome to the stage Grace Moreno, the Executive Director of the organization. Grace will be asking the next question to the panel. And since we started the last question with Councillor Wu, I would like to turn this question to Councillor Sabi George. And I'm going to turn it to Grace so that she takes the floor now. Grace, please take it away.
Thank you, Yvonne, and thank you, candidates, for being here tonight. When you see the statistics of disparities among the Latinx community, you will see that Latinx LGBTQ+ individuals fall further below the already devastating numbers, particularly from Brown and Black transgender members of our community. The current highest rate of homelessness and economic disparity within the LGBTQ+ population is among the highest in the Black and Brown transgender members of our community. What will you do to address the unique challenges and increased barriers this portion of our community faces in regards to housing, employment, healthcare, police brutality, and safety in general?
So I'm going to set my clock here. Grace, really appreciate that question. I think it's such an important topic for us to not just be aware of and have for discussion, but to make sure that we've got policies in place every single day, especially at the local level, to ensure that we are representing and empowering and protecting our LGBTQIA+ community and those that are of that membership and of color. I will work with the Boston Public Health Commission and our healthcare centers in particular, because they have certain cultural competencies and connections to community, language skills, and lived experiences. And making sure and ensuring that the healthcare provided is both gender and identity affirming and culturally competent. It's so important that we are empowering the organizations that do this work well to continue to do it in partnership, certainly with the city and supported by city organizations. I am committed to ensuring that our housing across our city is LGBTQIA+ friendly, and that we are being very intentional about creating more of those opportunities across our city and creating opportunities for affordable housing, as well as affordable ownership housing within that community, with a particular layered interest and particular focus on our communities of color. Certainly as a city, we need to make sure that we are celebrating our city's history and the history of the LGBTQIA+ community as it intersects with our Latino community, and that we are celebrating together those milestones. As mayor, I will fight alongside and uplift your voices and make sure that you have a seat at the table. This goes back to this representation matters. This goes back to empowering your voice, your experience, and sharing the power of the mayor's office and setting the agenda and doing the work in partnership with our LGBTQIA+ community. I also, want to make sure that it is not just simply a seat at the table, and that as mayor, I look to a member of your community to help with that decision making, but that you're actively informing and educating me on what my priorities should be as mayor, informing and educating me on your experiences. So as much as I don't personally live that experience, that I am part of the work with you and alongside you, and that the seat that I hold, that role that I will play, and that commitment that I will have to the people of Boston as mayor includes your voice and your work, especially as we think about the discrimination that exists, the challenges and the barriers to accessing all of government and all of the opportunities here in the city through housing, through school, through public safety, through public health, that it is part of that conversation and part of the work, not just simply the conversation. I think that it's also important to think about the experiences throughout the ages within the LGBTQI community. When we think about our young people, when we think about families, when we think about our older residents within that community, some of the additional challenges, some of the additional conflict that may exist because of generational differences, because of life experiences, and that we are fully aware and embracing that in the work. I'm grateful for that conversation, especially that very fine sort of tuned question for that experience in particular. I want to actually go back, Yvonne, if I could use the last 30 seconds to speak to that hesitation you referenced in the question around Rafaela and Lorena as members of the Boston School Committee. I think it's really important that we are looking at the city charter and the rules and regulations around interim appointments and the necessary rules we have to follow around the nominating process. We have to be transparent in this effort. And as mayor, I want to be held accountable to fulfilling the promise of a transparent effort around appointments to the Boston School Committee.
Thank you for your response, Councillor. That's appreciated. And that you actually took the time to go back to that. It's just, these two women have put their time in service, and it's hard enough seeking qualified candidates for some of these positions. So in the interest of transparency of where my question was going and why I made that comment, but thank you for that. And Grace, I apologize for taking the floor. The floor is yours, not mine, please. So I think we're going to Councillor Wu. Mm-hmm.
Right, I wouldn't be a Zoom if somebody didn't forget to unmute. So I think we're going to Councillor Wu on the same question.
Thank you very much, Grace. Thanks for your leadership and your example and advocacy on so many issues. I had written down some of the pieces. It's in some ways a lot of very big buckets that you brought up around housing, employment, police brutality, safety, and health. I think what we're really talking about here is the intersectionality of our communities and identities and the ways in which we see systemic marginalization, but also the intersectionality of the issues and how we address those from within City Hall. My number one pet peeve when it comes to city government is that we have so many resources and ways to provide services, but they are so siloed and separated from each other that we end up thinking that we're going to work on housing, but we actually can't think about housing unless we're addressing education, unless we're addressing police reform, and it's all interconnected. So I appreciate the breadth, but intersectionality of the question. And I think the response on my end is about how the tools we have in city government, from legislation, funding and budgets, personnel decisions, organizational changes, should all be fully directed to centering queer, trans, people of color in Boston. We have had, over the course of this last year and beyond, many conversations directly with community members about organizations, community-based advocacy organizations on the community side, as well as interactions with city government. And what we know is that there are many community-led efforts already underway. The Trans Emergency Fund, for example, looking to purchase and retrofit and run emergency housing centering trans residents and trans residents of color. And so the city can be a very strong partner in community-led efforts like that. The conversations around how at community gatherings and large-scale events such as marches or demonstrations, we want to move away from a police-led safety response to a community-led response. The city can be a very strong partner in that. And then on the organizational side, on sort of purely from what city government's power is, there is still legislation that we need to move forward. Again, I'll bring up the separation and the prohibition of the school to deportation pipeline through Boston Public Schools, and how we need to be very clear in every way that our organization is touching people's lives. Boston Public Schools, public housing, libraries, community centers, community health centers, that we have gender identity affirming, medically appropriate information that is available and resources that are accessible. And then just in terms of accountability for city government, my philosophy is that unless there is at least one person tasked with thinking about this all the time, it's just not going to happen when it's on a list of various departments with plates that are already very full. And so really empowering. Right now we have a position within City Hall that is the LGBTQ liaison to the community, that sits as part of and tremendous talent that has flowed through that position over the years. This needs to be an office that is built out and empowered to think about intersectionality, inclusion, and connecting resources across all of these different issue areas, not necessarily just interacting on certain events and issues one by one in the community. So you have my commitment that this will be an important part of the infrastructure and the relationship with City Hall.
Grace, you have a second question, so I'm going to turn back to you. And you're muted.
Good Lord. Okay, twice in one night, guys. Thank you, Councillor Wu. It's clear that you are in touch with all of the various pieces, and you as well, Councillor Sabi, George, to our community. It is my firm belief that there is no justice until there's economic justice. And prior administrations have not yet added LGBTQ plus businesses into the city's supplier diversity program. Do you have plans for enacting this moving forward? And why do you think it's important?
And we will start this question with Councillor Wu.
I am so excited to have the chance to really connect the spending power of the city with having an impact on building wealth in our communities. This has been a passion of mine, and more than 5 years ago, I led the charge on the council in partnership with then Councillor Ayanna Pressley to pass legislation that would reinstitute the Supplier Diversity Office, which had been dismantled years before, as well as require reporting so we could have that accountability on how city contracting dollars were being spent. It is through that legislation, as well as through subsequent subpoenas to get the administration to comply with that legislation, that we have seen just how stark the numbers were in terms of the $660 million plus annually that is spent. And in the first report, 0.65% going to businesses owned by people of color, less than 1% also going to Boston residents. And now with the most recent look back, over 5 years, billions of dollars spent on contracting, just 1.2% to Black and Latinx businesses. And so we need immediate change and again, similar conversation around how we spend our budget on outreach, technical assistance, building the pipeline, on a point of accountability with the chief of procurement, and building on the reforms that Mayor Janey has instituted on this front, unbundling our contracts so that we can see a foothold for local businesses to connect with opportunities and grow from there. And in particular, yes, absolutely. I believe that we need to ensure that we are investing in LGBTQ businesses, and that the City of Boston spending should be generating wealth and multiplying our dollars within our communities. This is important because we have an opportunity right now to rebuild our economy in a way that addresses the fragilities that COVID-19 has exposed and exacerbated, that businesses owned by people of color and businesses owned by LGBTQ residents have had barriers to accessing financing and capital, and therefore were much less likely to have the cushion necessary to survive a difficult shock like the pandemic. We have to invest in our businesses as anchors for our community, and that means investing in the full inclusion of our business community.
Thank you, Councillor Wu. Councillor Sabi George, it's your opportunity to respond to Grace's question.
Thank you, Grace, very much for that question and being very specific and direct about it. I think too often sometimes in government, we are painting with these broad brushstrokes and not asking the very direct questions and identifying the work that we need to be doing a better job of at the city level here in Boston at the municipal level. I think it's really important that we're doing a few things because for far too long, our economy has neglected our residents, our entrepreneurs, our small business owners of color. And we need to be very intentional and deliberate in supporting entrepreneurship and helping small businesses owned by people of color grow. And when we add on that layer, often of disenfranchisement as it relates to our LGBTQIA+ community, it is significantly more and disproportionately more shut out of the opportunities. We need to unbundle those large vendor contracts. I've led the work on the council, filing the home rule petition that will help break down those contracts. So communities of color in particular, women and locally owned businesses have access to those contracts, have opportunities to build their businesses. I think especially with the ARPA funds that are that are coming into our city, some of those dollars have started more to arrive, that those funds, that ARPA money in particular, it gives our city a true opportunity to invest in a sustainable way in our small business community. And I've committed to creating a $50 million fund that can be deployed directly to support Black, Latinx, LGBTQIA, the AAPI community, as well as those that have disabilities or are living with disabilities. We have to be very specific and intentional about how we can invest those dollars in a very specific way. We also need to make sure that we're creating that pipeline for the vendors of tomorrow, that we are identifying Black-owned, Latinx-owned, LGBTQI-owned businesses here in the city of Boston that have been disproportionately impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, many who have shuttered, many who continue to struggle, many who continue to seek stabilization. Those ARPA dollars are the key to that stabilization. Those ARPA dollars are also the key to funding and capitalizing on the pipeline for tomorrow. Entrepreneurs are innovative, are creative, and are ready for that next opportunity. We've got to be intentional about investing in our Latino-owned as well as our LGBTQIA-owned businesses here in the city of Boston. We've got to do the work through city departments to make sure, and community-based organizations to make sure that we are connected with those entrepreneurs who have continued to struggle and who may be ready for that next opportunity. And capital is the answer to that question and the work that we need to do around those sustainable investments.
Thank you very much, councillors, for those really meaningful responses, which I intend to follow up on shortly. In the meantime, I want to express my deep gratitude to Grace Moreno for taking the floor to ask these highly relevant questions at the intersection of not just Latino identity, but sexual orientation, gender identity, and other bases of identity. Thank you, Grace, for bringing that to this important forum for the mayoral candidates. And so, and thank you also for the Massachusetts LGBT Chamber of Commerce's sponsorship of this important event. Now I want to transition us to the Q&A component of the event. Unless anybody in the backstage is telling me that I'm out of sequence, but I think that's where we are at right now. And so the chat has been a buzz with people contacting me directly with questions, in addition to sharing general questions with the full audience. And so just to highlight a few of the topics, we won't be able to get to much of this, but just to raise it, to name it for the audience, for the candidates, questions around policing, which we kicked off with our amazing students, have received significant attention in the chat, with conversations about, we want to hear more about your recruiting plan to get diversity into the police department. What is the role of police officers in schools? I mean, all of these really relevant topics today, especially in light of George Floyd's murder. In addition to that, housing has been coming up a lot in the chat with people referring to rent control, among other local and potential interventions. Cost of living has been mentioned as a significant issue, which is of course tied to housing and gentrification and displacement and those themes. And so I just want to point that out. But the bottom line is that I do want to pick up a little bit on the themes developed by the LGBT Chamber of Commerce and Grace Moreno, to do a second question. And maybe for this component, since we're at the tail end of the event, if we could agree to 2-minute responses so we could get a few more things in here. I want to pick up on wealth building, the wealth gap, which frankly are things that both of you alluded to during your remarks, and closing those wealth opportunities and wealth gaps. So we're in the middle of the pandemic still, even though some people act like we're not, but we are. And the pandemic hit people disproportionately difficult in our communities, particularly small businesses. You guys alluded to this, but I want to hear more about your plans for wealth building in the city of Boston. How do we support business ownership? And connected to the issue of wealth building is, of course, home ownership as well, and building not just profitable enterprises that can contract with the city and do other important goods and services, but also wealth building through equity in real estate. And so I want to focus on that as the first question of the Q&A. What are your plans to close the wealth gap? And if you could focus on entrepreneurship, home ownership, these themes of equity, so that we do not have on our hands a widening gap under your leadership. And I want to start with you, Councillor Sabi George, as it's your turn, and then we will proceed with Councillor Wu on this question of wealth building and closing the wealth gap within communities of color and immigrant communities.
Thank you, Yvonne, for this question. And this is a question that we could absolutely use 4 minutes to talk about. When we think about building wealth, when we think about shrinking and closing and eliminating the wealth gap, you've answered the question in your question. It is about housing and home ownership. And for me, it's also about creating opportunities for first generation home buying. We talk a lot about first time home buyer programs and certainly the need for capital investment, down payment assistance, technical assistance, teaching and supporting that first time home buyer in that investment. First generation home buyers is really about families who have been here for a while but have never owned their own home, and the stabilization that brings to a family, to a child, to a community, and the opportunity that presents families to create legacy wealth is something that we have to invest in as a city. It's why I have committed to creating a fund that will invest $1 million in down payment assistance. We will work towards that starting on day one, and I hope to have that commitment firm by the time we roll out our first in the Sabi George budget for our city. It's also about investing in entrepreneurship, investing in people who are building businesses here in the city. As a small business owner myself, the wages that are paid in those small businesses, the sustainability it creates for not just the family of the entrepreneur, but for the families of the employees and for the extended community is tremendous. And sometimes it's so hard to measure that impact. That is why I've committed those opera dollars to small business supports across the board, because we see that as truly a sustainable investment when it comes to our city. It's also about workforce development. I'm committed in my first 100 days to roll out a strategic plan on Madison Park Vocational Technical High School. We need to create direct pipelines from our schools, from our communities for both kids and adults into the workforce and into the ever-changing and innovative economy that is here in Boston. Access is critical, putting more money in your pocket and in your bank to build that wealth.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Wu, please take it away.
Thank you. I'll start with the business ownership and equity and business side. And we talked a little bit already about the ways in which the city can have more structural change to ensure we're moving faster in this, setting goals that actually reflect the demographics of Boston and not just a 10% goal for what's called MBE, minority business enterprise spending. It should be much, much higher than that. But I'll give an example of how far we could go if the city of Boston were to set the tone for other sectors across the city. Just if you think about food businesses, we had passed legislation that required preference in choosing the vendors for Boston Public School food contracts to be locally produced, have racial equity in the vendors and sub-vendors that were chosen, fair wages, environmental sustainability. That is $18 million of purchasing power there. But we also began conversations with all of the hospitals and universities who are also serving so many meals to patients and students and faculty. That is $100 million then across just those three industries right within the borders of our city alone that would be creating local jobs, connecting local food producers to a reliable source of ongoing business and opportunity. And so it needs to be a conversation with our small businesses who get city contracts, not just how, how to represent our community in those contracts, but how we continue to boost that pipeline so they can move to larger contracts with other organizations or grow their supply chain and continue that way. Cooperative businesses are going to be a huge part of that. City Fresh Foods is an example where you have, if you can get a major contract and then have employee-owned business, that then builds wealth across so many more families. On home ownership, I'm running out of time. We need to boost home ownership through creating more housing, increasing the supports for down payment assistance, but also innovating on financing mechanisms that can help Black and Brown families, especially first-generation home buyers, be able to finance the homes in a different way, with the city of Boston helping with our credit rating, front some of we'd like to pilot a municipal home ownership voucher, for example. And the last piece, as Councillor Sabi George mentioned, vocational education is key also in ensuring that we're closing the racial wealth gap.
Thank you, Councillor. And the next question, since we are really running out of time, I'm just going to do 1 quick minute. So I just want to hear your thoughts very quickly on this 1 minute. But I would be remiss without, especially with the robust student participation in tonight's event, to not call out the fact that schools like the Margarita Muñiz, a bilingual school, offers a critical service for our community. And this type of school, including the Margarita Muñiz itself, is slated for growth. Is that something you would support? 1 minute, I'll start with you, Councillor Wu.
Yes, I don't know if I need the full minute. I've had the pleasure to visit and see the work happening at the Muñiz and at high schools and schools across our district. We need to keep expanding multilingual education, and I look forward to investing in that and helping to grow that.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Sabi George, the floor is yours on expansion of Margarita Muñiz.
No, absolutely, yes, and making sure that we are investing across our city in so many of our schools around the dual language, multi-language, and bilingual language programs, and ensuring that there is support for true fluency across languages that are reflective of the very diversity here in the city of Boston, not just in the Latino community, but in all of our communities. When we think about that rich diversity, especially around our immigrant populations here in the city of Boston, it is programming we have to invest in and make sure that our kids have access to these opportunities.
Thank you, councillors. This has been a spirited and terrific debate. I want to turn it over to the fabulous Doctora Vanessa Calderon Rosado, leader of the Greater Boston Latino Network and CEO of Inquilinos Boricuas en Acción, IBA, who will be closing out our program. Doctora Vanessa Calderon Rosado, the floor is yours.
Muchísimas gracias, Iván. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Councillor Sabi George and Councillor Wu, for your time today. Councillor Sabi George, we wish your son a very happy birthday. So when we hang up here tonight, hope you can enjoy with your family. This was a great conversation, a great forum. I want to thank both of you for your time. Obviously, the conversation is deeper than this, and we would love to get more into, especially with more details. but we appreciate the sense of urgency that you have put into these issues and your thoughtfulness as well. We also want to thank all of our partners tonight. As you know, this forum has come to you thanks to Amplify Latinx in partnership with the Greater Boston Latino Network, the Massachusetts LGBTQ Chamber of Commerce, and the Boston Debate League, and also through the partnership of the Boston Globe Media. So thanks to all of our partners and all of you here tonight. As you heard, there's so many more issues. You know, there were so many questions in the chat around diversity in the police department and Latino police officers, about restructuring the BPDA, about how are we going to fund the mass gas plan of the candidates that the candidates talked about Latino representation in their respective teams currently that could be a reflection of what will happen when for whoever wins. Questions around what are we going to do about people moving out of the city, especially working families? How are we going to keep those families around the cost of living? About participatory budget and about the Boston School Committee, among many others. The list goes on. So if you're still interested in these issues, which I know you are, what you need to do, this is your call to action. You need to make sure that you commit to vote on November 2nd, that you continue to stay tuned to our candidates to continue to better understand their positions on these important issues, that you check your registration, and if you're not registered to vote, you have a week until next Wednesday, October 13, precisely a week. October 13 at 8 p.m. is the deadline to register to be able to vote in the municipal elections in the city of Boston. So today, if you're registered, bravo, thank you, gracias. If you're not, you need to do it. You have a week, exactly 8 o'clock next Wednesday. And make sure that your family, your relatives, your friends, your neighbors also are registered to vote and come out to vote. Inform yourself, continue these two great candidates, and we are counting on you all to make sure that you come out to vote on November 2nd. Thank you very much. And thank you again to Amplify Latinx, the Mass LGBT Chamber of Commerce, Boston Debate League, Boston Globe Media, and of course, the Greater Boston Latino Network. Good night, everyone. And thank you again. Happy birthday to your son, Councillor. Good night.